I've spent 71 years learning that the sky doesn't lie. People do. The sky is just pressure, lift, and gravity. I learned that as a young man strapped into the cockpit of an F-4, and I learned it again in the back half of my life, when my own son tried to use the sky to kill me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Audrey always told me I did that, started a story at the ending, because the ending was the part that still kept me up at night. So, let me begin where it actually started. It wasn't in the mountains at all. It started in my kitchen 4 months before my birthday, with my son asking me for money in the gentlest voice he owned. "Dad, I'm not asking for a handout," Brooks said. He was sitting at my kitchen island in his good jacket, the one he wore to investor meetings, picking at a coaster in front of him. "I'm asking for a bridge, 60 days, maybe 90. The Avatron deal closes and I'll pay you back with interest. Real interest, Dad, better than your CDs. "What deal is it this time?" I asked. I already knew the answer would be vague. Brooks had a gift for making failure sound like momentum. "Aviation logistics, charter brokering, mostly private clients, some cargo overflow contracts. I've got 2 pilots lined up. I've got LOIs from 3 regional operators. Letters of intent aren't contracts, son. I know that." A flash of irritation quickly smoothed over the way he'd learned to smooth things over since he was a boy who broke a vase and told his mother the cat did it. We didn't have a cat. "I know the difference, Dad. I just need working capital to get through the next stretch. Giselle's bookings are down too. The wedding industry's soft right now. And between the 2 of us—" "How much?" "200,000. It's not charity. I'd sign whatever you want. A note, a lien on the business, whatever makes you comfortable." I looked at my son's face and saw Audrey's eyes in it. The same warm brown, and that was the only reason I didn't say what I was thinking. I had given him $40,000 18 months earlier for a craft brewery distribution venture that no longer existed, and $60,000 before that for something involving drone surveying that I never fully understood, and he never fully explained when it folded. I had buried his mother, and I didn't have the heart to bury her son's dignity along with her, not in my own kitchen over coffee. "I'll think about it," I said. "That's all I'm asking." He hugged me on his way out, and I felt something false in that hug, the catch in his breath that should have warned me. That's the thing nobody tells you about being lied to by someone you raised. It doesn't announce itself. It wears the clothes of love and walks right through your front door. I gave him 100,000, not 2. I told myself I was being careful. Looking back, I understand I was simply buying myself a few more months of believing in him. 3 weeks later, Giselle called me. Giselle, my daughter-in-law, who had always been kind to me. "Donnie, I just wanted to say thank you. Brooks doesn't always say it right, but it means everything to us." Her voice had a warmth to it, like a photographer arranging light before she takes the shot. I should have noticed that too, but I didn't. My 71st birthday was in October. Brooks called 2 weeks before, more animated than I'd heard him in a year. "Dad, I want to do something for you, something real. You always talk about the old days, the flying. I want to take you up. I rented a Cessna 206 out of Rocky Mountain Regional. We'll do the corridor over the Front Range, up past the Mummy Range, maybe swing toward Long's Peak if the winds cooperate. Just the 2 of us. Father-son flight, like the kind you used to take me on when I was a kid." I'll admit it moved me. We had taken exactly 1 flight together when he was 12, before Audrey's diagnosis turned every weekend into a hospital weekend. Before I sold the little plane, I kept at a private strip outside Fort Collins, because I couldn't justify the hangar fees while we were burying ourselves in medical bills. Brooks remembered that flight. He'd brought it up unprompted, which meant something to me, because Brooks rarely brought up anything that didn't serve a purpose. "You're flying it?" I asked. "You're current?" "I kept my certificate current, Dad. You know that. I take Giselle up sometimes for the wedding shoots, get the aerial shots of the venues. I'm solid. I just want to take my old man flying for his birthday. Can you let me do something nice for you for once?" Here's something about myself, something Brooks didn't know, something almost nobody in my current life knew. I didn't retire from logistics as I let people believe. I flew F-4 Phantoms and later F-16s for 22 years, 2 combat tours, and finished my career flying classified reconnaissance routes I'm still not permitted to discuss in detail. When I left the service, I didn't, as Brooks assumed, simply retire into a quiet civilian life. I used what I'd saved and what training had taught me about reading risk, and built a small fund that bought distressed manufacturing businesses, turned them around, and sold them. I was good at it for the same reason I was good at flying combat sorties. I could see 3 moves ahead, I didn't panic, and I never ever flew without a plan B. Brooks knew I had been in the Air Force. He didn't know what that meant. Audrey and I made a decision decades ago to let our children know us as parents and not as our service records. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe if Brooks had understood what his father actually was, what he was capable of noticing, what reflexes 17,000 flight hours leave behind in a man's hands and eyes, maybe none of what happened next would have happened. Or maybe it would have happened exactly the same way because greed doesn't do reconnaissance. Greed just wants. All right, I told him. I'd like that son. I'd like that very much. I should have wondered even then why a man who couldn't make rent on his office lease had suddenly found $400 to rent a Cessna 206 for an afternoon joyride. I noticed it and filed it away. I have always had a rule: trust but verify, and never stop verifying just because someone smiles at you. The morning of my birthday, I packed my bag the way I packed a bag before every flight of my life, going back to flight school in 1976. People think old habits are sentimental. Mine are operational. I packed a folding knife, a signal mirror, a space blanket, 40 feet of paracord, a small first aid kit, 3 energy bars, a whistle, a headlamp, a lighter, waterproof matches, and a compact handheld radio. I kept charged in my truck. I packed it into a small backpack I used on every general aviation flight for 30 years, the same way some men carry a wallet. Audrey used to tease me about it. "Donnie, we're going up for 40 minutes not crossing the Rockies on foot." I always told her the same thing. The day I don't need it is the day I was right to bring it. I didn't know packing that bag in my garage on the morning of October the 11th, that I was about to need every single item in it, and that the man who would force me to use it was my own son. The morning was clean and cold, the kind of Colorado October morning where the sky looks clear. Brooks met me at Rocky Mountain Regional, in jeans and his old college fleece, looking, for once, like the boy I remembered instead of the man he'd become. He'd already done the pre-flight, he told me, walk me around the Cessna with a checklist clipped to a board, narrating fuel levels and control surfaces in a voice that sounded almost professional. I let him have that. I watched his hands instead of listening too closely to his words, because hands tell you more than mouths do, and his hands were a little too quick, a little too eager to move past each item. "You good, Dad?" Excited. "I'm good," I said, and climbed into the right seat because he wanted to fly left seat, pilot in command, his show. I let him have that too. We took off northwest, climbing out over the reservoir, the city falling away below us in its grid of gray and gold. For the first 20 minutes, it was genuinely one of the best mornings of my life. We talked about nothing, about a Broncos game, about a restaurant he and Giselle liked downtown. We talked a little about his mother, the way we sometimes did when the silence between us softened enough to let her in. He pointed out the shape of a ridge and asked if I remembered taking him up as a boy. I said I did. And for a moment neither of us said anything at all. The engine hummed, and the mountains rose up gold and granite beneath the wings, and I foolishly thought that maybe I had my son back. We crossed into the high country around 11, following the corridor up past Estes Park, the peaks closing in gray and serious beneath a thin scattering of cloud. Brooks had been quieter for the last 10 minutes. I noticed that too. I noticed the way he kept glancing at his watch, not the altimeter. His watch, like he was timing something that had nothing to do with the flight plan. "You okay?" I asked him. Yeah, I'm good. Just watching the winds. They said it might pick up over the divide." It was at 11:41 by the clock on the panel that the engine note changed. It didn't stop, just changed. A rough cough, a stutter, the kind of sound that makes every pilot's spine go straight, and Brooks' hands went to the controls with a speed and theatricality that struck me, even in that first second of alarm, as slightly wrong. Too fast. "Dad, we've got a problem. Engine's losing power. I'm not getting good fuel flow." His voice climbed half an octave. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." I have turned that moment over 10,000 times since. Even with everything I would learn an hour later, I didn't in that instant think my son was lying to me. I thought my son had a mechanical emergency, because that's what 30 years of training tells you to think when an engine note changes and your pilot in command says the word emergency. I went into the checklist in my head automatically. Fuel selector, mixture, carb heat, mags, the way you go through CPR steps on instinct even if you've never had to use them. I started reaching for the panel. "Let me look at the fuel selector." "There's no time, Dad. Listen to me." Brooks reached behind my seat and pulled out a parachute pack, the kind of emergency bailout rig some backcountry operators carry, and shoved it into my lap so hard it knocked the wind half out of me. "We're going down. I need you to put this on and jump. Now. I've got it under control up here. I'm going to try to glide her toward the meadow, but you need to go. You need to go now." "Brooks, where's your chute?" "I've got mine, Dad. It's on. Just go." I looked and saw it strapped to his back already, snug, professional, like he'd put it on before we ever took off and worn it under his jacket the entire flight. Something in my chest went very cold and very still. The strange stillness that comes right before a combat pilot's mind splits cleanly in two, one half still flying the airplane, the other half already 3 steps into a different war. Here is what 22 years in a fighter cockpit teaches you that no civilian flight school ever will. In the half second before catastrophe, your body will tell you the truth before your mind catches up. My body told me the truth. There was one parachute pack in that aircraft. My son was already wearing it. I didn't argue with him because I think if I had argued, if I had accused him right there at 11,000 feet, he might have done something even worse than what he'd already planned. Instead, 22 years of training did something for me that no amount of grief or love or shock could undo. I became in that instant a pilot assessing a battlefield, not a father confronting his son. "Okay," I said. My voice came out steady the way it had come out over hostile airspace decades earlier. Steady because I had trained that steadiness into my own nervous system. "Okay, help me with the straps." Brooks's hands were shaking as he helped cinch the harness over my shoulders. I watched his face the entire time, and what I saw there wasn't a son saving his father. What I saw was a man performing the act of saving his father for an audience that existed only in his own head, already rehearsing. I would later understand the grief-stricken story he would tell investigators, his sister-in-law, the insurance company, the cameras. There were no tears in his eyes. There was concentration, and there was relief. "Go, Dad, go now. I'll try to put her down in the meadow. I'll see you on the ground." He would not see me on the ground. That was the entire design of the thing, and we both knew it, though only one of us was saying it out loud. I went to the door. I looked back at him one final time. "Brooks, Dad, please, there's no time." "I love you, son," I said, and I meant it. Heaven help me even then, even knowing what I now knew. I meant it the way you can love someone and see exactly what they are doing to you in the same breath. Because that's what 32 years of being someone's father does to you. It doesn't turn off because the someone turns out to be a stranger wearing your son's face. Then I jumped. I'm not going to pretend the jump itself was easy because it wasn't. Not at 70 years old. Not with a chute I hadn't packed myself. Not over the kind of jagged timbered country that has swallowed better men than me. But I had jumped from aircraft before in service of my country, under conditions a great deal more hostile than my son's quiet betrayal at 11,000 feet over Colorado. And my body remembered what to do, even while my mind was still working through the arithmetic of what had just happened to me. The canopy opened clean. I'll thank whoever packed that chute, because they did their job even if my son was banking on it, failing, or perhaps banking on the terrain doing what the chute didn't. Or maybe, and this is the thought that came to me, clearest of all, swinging under that canopy with the whole gold and granite world spread out below me. Maybe Brooks hadn't thought that far ahead at all. Maybe my son's plan had never extended past the moment of watching me disappear beneath the wing. Performers rarely rehearse the second act. I looked up and saw the Cessna continue on. Engine note steady now, no stutter at all, climbing slightly, banking south. There had been no engine failure. There had never been an engine failure. My son had faked a mechanical emergency to get a parachute onto my back and force me out of an airplane at 11,000 feet over the Rockies. The only reason I was alive to think that thought was that I had spent 22 years learning to read the difference between a man in genuine crisis and a man performing one. I came down hard in a stand of lodgepole pine above 8,000 feet, hit a branch on the way through that tore my jacket and opened a 4-inch gash along my forearm, and landed in deep duff with enough force to knock the air clean out of me. I lay there for a moment, looking up at torn sky through the canopy, doing the inventory every pilot does after a hard landing. Fingers, toes, neck, spine, breath, and found to my genuine surprise that I was largely intact. Bruised ribs, the cut arm, a wrenched knee that would announce itself more loudly over the following hours. Nothing broken. I got the canopy collapsed and stowed, because old training doesn't quit just because your son tried to kill you. I sat against a tree for a few minutes, doing the second thing old training teaches you, which is stop, breathe, assess, before you do one more thing. I assessed. My son had faked an engine failure. My son had a parachute strapped to his body before we ever left the ground. My son had forced his 70-year-old father out of an aircraft at altitude over remote technical mountain terrain in October, when overnight temperatures at that elevation drop into the 20s, with no parachute training, no GPS locator, and, he believed, No way down, except the one his own body would provide in the form of impact with several thousand feet of Rocky Mountain granite. 4 months ago, that same son had asked me for $200,000 and accepted 118 months before that. 40,000 for a brewery, and before that, 60,000 for drones. My son wasn't impulsive, he had been testing for years, exactly how much I would hand him without resistance. And somewhere in the last several months, my son had stopped believing he could get what he wanted from me while I was alive. I didn't let myself feel the full weight of that thought yet. There would be time for grief later, and there was, heaven knows, a great deal of it waiting for me. But sitting in that stand of pine with blood drying along my forearm, I made a decision that probably saved both my life and eventually my soul. I wasn't going to be a grieving father stumbling down a mountain. I was going to be exactly what 22 years had trained me to be. A pilot who had survived an unplanned departure from a hostile environment, executing a survival plan point by point. The way I had drilled 100 times in SEER training decades earlier, and never once expected to need again at 70 years old. I opened my pack: knife, mirror, blanket, cord, bars, whistle, headlamp, matches, radio. Every item earned its place in that pack that day, and every item Audrey had teased me about for 30 years sat in my hands like a love letter from a woman 7 years gone, who had never once told me to leave the bag at home. Not really, not when it mattered. I switched on the handheld radio. It was a basic unit, not aviation band capable of reaching ATC from that terrain reliably, but I'd programmed a set of frequencies into it years ago, for exactly the kind of situation, however improbable I'd thought it at the time, where I might need to reach someone who knew these mountains better than the Forest Service did. I dialed to the frequency August, and I had used for 20 years of backcountry trips. The one we joked was older than half the radios that could still receive it. August Reyes was an Air Force buddy, 41 years deep, the man who'd been my wingman in 2 different postings, and my best friend for longer than I'd been anyone's husband. August had retired to a cabin outside Granby, 40 minutes by truck from where I now sat, and August, unlike my son, had never once in 41 years given me a reason to doubt what came out of his mouth. It took 6 tries and a relocation up a ridge to get a clean signal. When his voice finally crackled through rough with sleep, it wasn't yet noon, but August kept old man's hours and older man's naps. I felt something in my chest unclench for the first time since I'd watched that Cessna Bank south without me in it. "Donnie, that you? You're breaking up. What channel is this?" "August, I need you to listen to me and not ask questions yet, because I don't have a lot of battery and I don't have a lot of time before the cold matters more than the conversation. I'm on the ground above Timberline, east face roughly 9,000 feet south of the corridor toward Long's. I was forced out of an aircraft. I'm alive. I'm hurt but mobile. I need you to come get me, and when you do, I need you to bring your truck, your good boots, and absolutely nobody else, because nobody else can know I'm alive yet. Not yet. Do you understand what I just said to you?" There was a silence on the line longer than the static should have allowed, and when August spoke again, every trace of sleep was gone, from his voice replaced by the same flat, focused calm I remembered from 2 combat tours together. 41 years melted away in 3 words. "Who pushed you?" "Brooks." Another silence. "Give me your coordinates as close as you can call them. I'm coming. And Donnie, I'm not telling a soul either, not till you say so. You hold tight." I gave him what I could from terrain features and my last known GPS fix before the jump. Then I did what every survival manual tells you to do, and almost nobody actually manages to do, which is sit still, conserve heat, conserve energy, and wait, instead of thrashing downhill toward a rescue that hasn't arrived yet. I wrapped the space blanket around my shoulders, packed snow against the cut on my arm to slow the bleeding, ate half an energy bar, and watched the sky for smoke. Because here's the part I haven't told you yet, the part I'd been turning over since the moment I watched that Cessna level out and continue south without an engine failure in it at all. My son had not faked a crash, my son intended a real one, just not for himself. He needed wreckage, he needed a story. A father, dead in a plane crash, conveniently solo by then, since the rescuer's son parachuted to safety after a heroic failed attempt to save him. That story needed a burned fuselage at the bottom of it, and the only way to get a burned fuselage was to put the plane into the ground. Which meant somewhere in the next 20 minutes, my son was going to deliberately crash a rented Cessna 206 into Colorado wilderness and walk, or rather, parachute away from it himself. And somewhere in an office in Denver, paperwork would already be drafted referencing the unfortunate and tragic loss of Donald Craven, 71, beloved father, decorated veteran in a private aviation accident. I wasn't going to let him have the satisfaction of being right about the crash, but I was very much going to let him believe he was right about the death. August found me 4 hours later, as the light was starting to slant gold and long, and the temperature was beginning its serious autumn drop. He came up a game trail on foot from where he'd left the truck, because the terrain past a certain elevation simply doesn't allow vehicles. And when he saw me leaning against that lodge pole with a bloodied space blanket around my shoulders, this 73-year-old man, who had once pulled me out of a downed aircraft in conditions a great deal worse than this one, dropped to his knees beside me like his legs had simply stopped being interested in holding him up. Hell, Donnie. I'm all right, banged up, knees bad, my arm needed stitches an hour ago and didn't get them, but I'm all right. He helped me up, got an arm under my shoulder, and as we started the slow walk down toward where he'd left the truck, he asked me the question I knew was coming and had been dreading answering out loud, because saying it out loud was going to make it real in a way that surviving it hadn't quite managed yet. He just pushed you out? His own father? He faked an engine failure, had his own chute on under his jacket before we ever left the ground. He told me he'd glided into a meadow. There was no meadow, August. There was no engine failure. He needed me out of that aircraft so he could put it into the ground and walk away from it himself. He told me to jump, and that to me is the same as pushing me. August didn't say anything for a long while. We'd flown together long enough, fought together long enough, buried enough friends together, that he understood something most people never learn, which is that some news doesn't need commentary. It just needs a hand under your arm and a steady pace downhill. "What do you want to do?" he finally said. Not, "What should we do?" What do you want to do? August had always understood that this was fundamentally my decision to make, however much he was prepared to stand beside me while I made it. "I want to know why," I said, "and I want to know everything before he or Giselle ever finds out I'm alive, because the second they know, the lying stops being useful to me and starts being useful to him. Right now, for the first time since my son pushed me out of an airplane, I have something he doesn't know I have. I have the truth, and he doesn't know I survived to learn it." We got down to the truck as the light failed completely, and from a ridge with a clean sightline south before we left, I looked back one final time and saw a column of black smoke rising thin and steady from a draw maybe 2 miles distant, catching the last orange light like something out of a bad dream. My son had crashed that Cessna. He'd done it on purpose somewhere out of my sightline, probably in a clearing he'd scouted in advance the same calculating way he'd scouted everything else about this trip, and he'd set it burning deliberately, to make sure that whatever remained would tell investigators a story about a fuel-fed post-impact fire instead of a controlled, intentional descent followed by an act of arson. I watched the smoke for a long moment. Then I got in August's truck and we drove to his cabin outside Granby. I didn't call 911 and I didn't call the Larimer County Sheriff, neither did I call my son. I called a man named Russell Fraser instead, a retired Air Force JAG officer I'd known for 30 years. Who had gone on to a long career as a federal prosecutor before retiring himself. I trusted him with my life in roughly the same way I trusted August, because trust like that doesn't come from friendship alone. It comes from watching someone operate under pressure for decades and never once seeing them flinch from the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. "Russell, it's Donnie Craven. I need a very particular kind of help, and I need it quietly, tonight." I told him everything. By the time I finished, it was past midnight, and Russell, who had listened quietly, exhaled slowly into the phone. "Donnie, I'm so sorry. I need you to understand something before we go one step further. What you're describing, attempted murder, staged accident, the foundation for what sounds like an insurance and estate fraud scheme, that's not a private matter anymore, however much you might want it to be. That's federal. I know. You have to be the one to decide how you want to handle the next 48 hours, but I'm going to tell you what I'd advise as your friend and what I'd advise as a prosecutor, and they happen to be the same advice. Stay dead, for now. Don't surface. The moment Brooks and Giselle know you're alive, every piece of evidence they're about to generate, every claim they file, every email, every conversation about your estate stops being generated, because they'll know you're watching. Right now they think they got away with it. Let them keep thinking that. Let them build the case against themselves. I sat in August's kitchen that night, 71 years old, my arm finally stitched by a retired Army medic, August new in town who asked no questions and kept no records, my body aching in a dozen places, and I thought about my son's face in that cockpit, not afraid or grieving, just relieved, and I made the decision that shaped the next 6 weeks of my life. I was going to let Brooks believe he had killed me, and I was going to use every single hour of his certainty against him. Russell brought in the FBI 4 days later, Once I'd been moved quietly by night, in the back of August's truck under a tarp-like cargo, which felt, at 71 years old, like an undignified way to travel, and also exactly correct given the circumstances, to a federal safe house outside Loveland. An agent named Tanya Redding led the case. She was a sharp, economical woman in her 40s who had clearly worked white-collar fraud long enough to have lost any capacity for surprise at what families do to each other over money. "Mr. Craven, I want to be honest with you about what we're dealing with," she told me on our first morning across a folding table in a safe house. "Attempted murder is the headline, but it's not actually the hardest thing to prove, because we have you. We have a living witness intact, with a story that matches a real parachute, real terrain, a real radio call to a corroborating party within hours. What's harder to prove, and what I want to nail completely before we move on anyone, is the financial architecture underneath it. Because men like your son rarely commit murder for its own sake. They commit murder because murder is the fastest route to money they've already started spending in their heads." She was right. Over the following days, with my reluctant but complete cooperation, I gave them access to every account, every trust document, every email Brooks and Giselle had ever sent me. A picture assembled itself that was, in some ways, harder to absorb than the moment in the cockpit had been. Because the cockpit had been one terrible decision made in 11 seconds. This was a terrible decision made patiently over years. Brooks had filed for a hardship distribution from a small trust I'd set up for him in his 20s. Standard practice, the kind of thing any father does. 11 days before my birthday flight. An application that required, under its terms, a declaration that he expected a change in his financial circumstances within 90 days. 90 days. He had scheduled my death before he'd ever boarded a plane. Giselle, meanwhile, had contacted 3 different life insurance brokers over the preceding 8 months, inquiring under her maiden name through an LLC. Neither of them realized investigators could trace back to her. About policies on elderly relatives, key man insurance structures, and the typical timeline for payout following an accidental death determination. She was a wedding photographer. She understood better than most people how to stage a beautiful lie and make sure every frame supported the story. And 48 hours after the crash, 48 hours after my son convinced himself he had watched his father die in a burning Cessna in the Colorado wilderness, Brooks and Giselle met with an estate attorney in downtown Denver to begin the process of accelerating probate on my estate, citing in writing the tragic and untimely loss of Donald Craven, and requesting expedited handling given what they described as significant outstanding business obligations requiring immediate liquidity. 48 hours. My son did not spend 48 hours grieving me. He spent them filing paperwork. Agent Redding let that process run for 6 weeks. 6 weeks in which I lived in a rented house outside Loveland under a name that wasn't mine, in which August visited twice a week with groceries and bad coffee and worse jokes, because somebody needed to make me laugh during the worst stretch of my life since Audrey's diagnosis, in which Russell walked me gently and repeatedly through what federal sentencing guidelines actually looked like for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and wire fraud conspiracy. I think he understood I needed the cold, structural facts of it more than I needed comfort. Comfort wasn't going to fix what my son had done. Understanding it completely in granular legal detail was the only thing that gave me something to hold on to, besides grief. In those 6 weeks, Brooks held a memorial service. I wasn't there, obviously, but Agent Redding had agents quietly photographing attendees from a respectful distance. Standard practice in a case like this. August went. Because August was supposed to be there, my oldest friend weeping convincingly into a handkerchief, while wearing a small recording device the FBI had given him, because nothing in 41 years of friendship had prepared either of us for the moment he would need to stand at my fake funeral and listen to my son deliver my eulogy. He gave me the recording afterward. I made myself listen to it once, only once, sitting alone in that rented house with a glass of bourbon I didn't drink, because I needed to know exactly what kind of performance my son was capable of. My father taught me everything about resilience, Brooks's recorded voice said. Calm, warm, grief-pitched exactly correctly for an audience of 40 mourners who loved me and didn't know they were being lied to. He survived things most of us can't imagine, and it's almost unbearable that the sky, which gave him so much joy his whole life, is what finally took him from us. I tried to save him. I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I couldn't. I turned off the recording and sat in the dark for a long time. Then I called Russell and told him I was ready to talk about the next phase, because grief, I had decided, is a luxury you allow yourself once the danger has passed, and the danger had very much not passed yet. There was one piece of audio Agent Redding played for me that I have never been able to fully set down, even now, even with everything that came after it. It was a phone call between Brooks and Giselle, recorded under a warrant 3 weeks after my funeral while they sat in their kitchen, the same kind of kitchen island I'd sat at 4 months earlier, listening to my son talk about bridges in 90 days. "The coroner's office is dragging their feet on the certificate," Brooks said, irritation thick in his voice. A man inconvenienced by paperwork rather than haunted by grief. "Raymond says we can't touch the trust funds without it. We're bleeding cash, Gigi. The Avatron people are calling daily. Did you tell them your father just died?" Giselle's voice, flat, businesslike, the voice of a woman discussing a vendor delay, not a death. "I told them. They said their condolences and then asked again about the payment schedule." A short, ugly laugh. "Nobody actually cares, you know that? Everyone says they're sorry, and then they ask about the money in the same breath. You're the one who keeps bringing up the money in the same breath, Brooks. Because we need it. Because this whole thing only works if it actually closes. I didn't..." A pause, the particular pause of a man choosing his next words even in what he believed was a private conversation. "I didn't do what I did, so we could sit around for 3 more months waiting on a piece of paper." Agent Redding paused the recording there and looked at me carefully. "I wanted you to hear that one yourself before trial, rather than first in a courtroom. I'm sorry, Mr. Craven." I sat with it a long while before I answered her. He said, "What I did. Not what happened, not the accident." Yes. That's not a man who believes his own story. That's a man performing it. I remember looking down at my hands, at the thin pale scar already forming along my forearm, where a lodgepole branch had opened me up on the way down. I think some part of me was still waiting for evidence he'd talked himself into believing the lie. That would have been easier to live with somehow. A son who fooled himself, not a son who simply calculated. "For what it's worth," she said, "in 11 years of doing this, the calculating ones are rarer than you'd think. Most people who hurt their families this badly need to believe their own cover story, at least a little, just to be able to look in a mirror. Your son didn't seem to need that. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I've stopped trying to decide. I've stopped trying to decide too. Some mornings, I think it's worse. That a son cold enough to calculate rather than rationalize is a stranger I never actually knew at all, hiding inside a boy I raised. Other mornings, I think it's almost a mercy, because at least it means none of it was really about me. It was never personal. It was arithmetic. I was simply the largest number standing between my son and the life he believed he deserved without earning it. The case Agent Redding built over those 6 weeks was, by her own description, uncomfortably clean. A phrase she used the way some people say lucky, meaning it without quite trusting it. Brooks and Giselle had been so confident I was dead that they had stopped being careful in the specific way that only the genuinely confident ever stop being careful. They emailed each other about timelines. They texted a contractor about renovating my house, the house I was, at that moment, very much alive enough to be furious about. Giselle posted on a private account she didn't realize investigators had already obtained legal access to, a photograph of swatches for what she called the new place, 6 weeks after burying her father-in-law, captioned with a single champagne emoji. The arrest, when it finally came, was built around a meeting Brooks had scheduled with the estate attorney to finalize the early release of funds from the trust. Funds that required, under its terms, a death certificate, which under Colorado law required confirmation from the coroner's office, which the FBI, working with Russell and a sympathetic federal magistrate, had quietly delayed issuing on entirely legitimate procedural grounds related to ongoing investigation into the cause of the crash, a delay Brooks and Giselle interpreted in increasingly impatient emails to their attorney as bureaucratic incompetence rather than what it actually was, which was a net slowly closing. Agent Redding asked me the week before the arrest whether I wanted to be there. I thought about it for 3 days. Russell told me I had every right to refuse, that plenty of victims in cases like this choose never to see the perpetrator again until a courtroom forces the issue. August told me more bluntly over coffee in his kitchen, "Donnie, you don't owe that boy 1 more second of your time than the law requires." Both of them were right in their own ways, but I had spent 6 weeks turning over the moment in that cockpit, the moment my son looked at me with no fear in his eyes and only relief, and I had decided I needed to look at his face 1 more time, not for him, but for me, for the part of me that needed to know with my own eyes that I had survived something real and that the man who did it to me would finally see what surviving looked like. I went. It happened on a Wednesday morning, gray and ordinary, in the parking garage beneath the estate attorney's office building in the downtown Denver, where Brooks and Giselle had arrived together for what they believed was a routine meeting about the early trust disbursement. I sat in the back of an unmarked bureau vehicle 2 levels up. Watching on a monitor Agent Redding had positioned for me, my hands flat on my knees, my heart doing something I hadn't felt it do since my last combat sortie decades earlier. That particular focused stillness that exists right on the edge of an event you cannot control and must simply let happen. I watched my son get out of his car in his good jacket, the investor meeting jacket, and reach back to help Giselle out of the passenger seat, the two of them laughing at something, easy, light. The laugh of people who believe the hardest part of their year is already behind them. I watched 4 agents move in from 2 directions, calm and fast the way trained people move, and I watched my son's face change in real time, from confusion to a kind of dawning utter horror that I recognized, because I had worn that exact expression myself 6 weeks earlier, 11,000 feet over the Rockies, in the half second before I understood what was actually happening to me. Brooks Craven, you're under arrest for attempted murder, mail and wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. You have the right to remain silent. I watched my son's knees actually buckle, watched an agent catch him under the arm, the same way August had caught me on that mountainside, and there was something almost unbearable in that visual echo, my son held up by a stranger's hand, exactly as I had been held up by my oldest friends. Except one of us had earned that support, and one of us had manufactured the need for it. "This is insane," Brooks was shouting, his voice carrying tinny and distorted through the monitor's speaker. "My father died. My father is dead. I watched the plane go down." "Your father," Agent Redding said, stepping into frame with a calm that had a blade in it, "would like to have a word." She nodded up toward the level where I waited, and I understood suddenly that this was the moment Russell and Tanya had quietly engineered for me without ever quite saying so out loud. Not required by procedure, not standard practice, a small mercy built into a process that didn't usually make room for mercy. I walked down the ramp into that gray garage on a knee that still ached from a 40-foot fall through lodgepole pine, and I watched my son's face when he saw me. I have tried in the months since to find language adequate to what I saw in that moment, and I'm not sure I ever will. It wasn't relief or joy at finding his father alive. It was the total collapse of a man who has just watched the one fact his entire fabricated world was built on, his father's death, turn out to be false in front of federal agents, in front of his wife, in front of the very life he had been planning to step into. Giselle beside him had gone the color of old paper, her mouth working without sound. "Dad," Brooks finally said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable in a way that, 4 months earlier, would have broken my heart. "Dad, I can explain." "You don't need to explain to me, son," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "I was there. I know exactly what happened. I felt the parachute you put on my back because there was only one in that aircraft and it was already strapped to yours. I watched you fly south with no engine failure at all. I sat in the snow with a torn arm and a busted knee for 4 hours while you told 40 people at my funeral that the sky took me from you. I know precisely what happened, Brooks. I'm not here for an explanation. I'm here because I needed to see your face when you understood that I knew." "Dad, please!" "You called me your father in front of those mourners," I said, and this was the part I had practiced, the part I needed to say out loud in that garage more than I had needed almost anything in my 71 years. "You stood up at a memorial for a man you tried to murder, and you used the word father to make yourself look like a son who'd lost something instead of a son who'd taken it. I buried your mother for real, Brooks. I sat by her bed every single day for 14 months, and I watched a tumor take her sentence by sentence until she couldn't say my name anymore. And I never once, not for one single second, thought about what dying would be worth to me in dollars. You had a father who loved you enough to give you $100,000 he didn't have to give, and instead of being grateful, you decided the only thing standing between you and the rest of it was how long I planned to keep living." Giselle beside him finally found her voice thin and pleading. "Donnie, I never wanted—" "You inquired about life insurance policies on elderly relatives under a maiden name LLC 8 months before my birthday flight," I said, and watched the last of the color leave her face entirely. "You posted paint swatches for my house 6 weeks after my funeral. I'm not interested in what you wanted, Giselle. I'm interested in what you did. Those are different things, and only one of them matters to a federal jury. I stepped back then because I had said what I came to say, and there is a kind of grief that doesn't need an audience to finish breaking your heart. Mine was finishing right there in that gray garage, even as I held my spine straight and my voice level, because some part of me, the father part, The part that had hugged my son in my kitchen 4 months earlier and believed every word he'd said about bridges in 90 days, would mourn the boy I thought I'd raised for the rest of my life, even while I watched federal agents lead the man he'd actually become into the back of a car. 8 months later, Brooks pleaded guilty to attempted murder and conspiracy to commit wire and insurance fraud, in exchange for a sentence recommendation of 19 years, after his attorney made clear that going to trial against a living, articulate, decorated victim with corroborating physical evidence, a recovered parachute pack, recovered accelerant residue from the crash site, and a recorded eulogy describing a death he knew to be staged, was not a fight likely to end well for him. Giselle, who cooperated against him in exchange for a reduced sentence on the fraud counts, will serve 6 years, the kind of arithmetic that I have decided not to spend the remainder of my life being angry about, because anger, I've learned, makes a poor permanent resident. It visits. It doesn't get to move in. I think about that cockpit often, more than I'd like to admit. I think about the half second when my body understood the truth before my mind did, the training that saved my life long after I believed I'd put it behind me for good. I think about August's hands under my arm on that mountainside, about Russell's voice telling me patiently that staying dead for 6 weeks was the bravest and hardest thing I would ever choose to do. I think about Audrey and the bag she teased me for packing every single flight of our life together, and how the day I finally needed it was the day it saved me from the one person I never imagined I'd need saving from. I rebuilt my will with Russell's help into something cleaner, something that requires real transparency from every party with a claim on it, something that protects the people in my life who never once, in 40 years of friendship or loyalty, gave me a single reason to doubt them. August is in it. So is the medic who stitched my arm without asking a single question he didn't need answered. So, in a modest and deliberate way, is a scholarship fund in Audrey's name for nursing students studying neuro-oncology care. Because if there is anything I learned from losing her slowly and losing my son suddenly, it's that the people who actually deserve what you've built rarely ask you for it directly. They just show up again and again, with their hands ready to catch you. There's a kind of quiet that settles over a courtroom when a guilty plea is read aloud. I want to tell you about it because I don't think anyone prepares you for how anticlimactic justice actually feels when it finally arrives. I expected somewhere in my chest a kind of release, the sense of a held breath finally let go. It didn't come, not that day. Brooks stood beside his attorney in a county-issued jumpsuit that had replaced the good jacket entirely, and he said the word guilty 4 times, once for each count. I sat in the gallery between August and Russell and felt nothing so dramatic as relief. I felt the bone-deep tiredness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he's finally allowed to set it down. Except your arms don't know how to stop bracing just because someone tells them the weight is gone. Giselle wouldn't look at me during her own hearing 6 weeks later. I understood that. I think in her own way she had loved my son enough to let him talk her into believing the ends would somehow excuse the means. The way people in bad marriages talk themselves into smaller and smaller compromises until one day they look up and realize the compromise was their entire moral compass. I don't excuse what she did. I do occasionally feel something for her that isn't quite forgiveness, but sits somewhere in its neighborhood. Pity maybe, for a woman who married ambition and discovered too late that ambition doesn't stop at the edges. Most people assume it will. August still drives up from Granby every other Sunday. We don't talk about the mountain much anymore, not directly. We found our way back slowly to the easier conversations, fishing and football. And which of us is going to actually win at cribbage this time? The ordinary architecture of a friendship that has outlasted 2 wars and 1 attempted murder. But every so often, usually late, usually with a second bourbon between us, he'll look at me across the table and say, "You did good up there, Donnie." And I'll know exactly what mountain he means, and I'll nod, because some debts you can only repay with a nod and the simple fact of still being alive to receive the thanks. I drove past my son's old office last month, the one he leased with money I gave him, the one that closed within weeks of his arrest, and I sat in my truck outside it for longer than I meant to, watching a new tenant sign go up in the window, some accounting firm with a name I didn't recognize. I let myself grieve properly for the first time since that cockpit, not for the man in the federal facility 3 states away who calls me twice a year on a recorded line and asks every single time whether I'll ever forgive him. I grieved for the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of my old Cessna before we ever sold it, who used to ask me to tell him about flying until he ran out of questions, who I genuinely believe, somewhere underneath everything that came after, I actually did raise with love. I don't know exactly where that boy went or when the calculating stranger moved in and started wearing his face. I've made my peace with not knowing. Some mysteries, even a man who flew reconnaissance for 22 years, has to leave unsolved. If you're watching this and you've got someone in your life whose love feels, in hindsight, like it always had a number quietly attached to it, I want you to hear something from a man who almost paid the very highest price there is for not seeing it sooner. Generosity isn't the same as trust. Trust has to be earned in the dark, in the moments nobody's watching, not just performed in the light when someone needs something from you. Pay attention to the people who show up when there's nothing in it for them. Those are the ones worth building a life around. The others will tell you they love you right up until the moment loving you stops being convenient. And by the time you find that out, you may already be the one without a parachute. I'm 72 now. I still fly when the weather's good and my knee allows it. Though I check my own parachute these days, every single time, with my own 2 hands. And I never again let another pilot's words stand in for my own verification. Not even a son's. Audrey used to tease me about that backpack I never stopped packing. I like to think, wherever she is, she's not teasing me anymore. I like to think she's just glad I finally got to use it for what it was always for. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your own life, and the difference between the ones who love you and the ones who are simply waiting on you, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Tell me in the comments, would you have seen it coming 11,000 feet up with your own son's hands on the straps? Stay close to Story Junkie, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. True to the bone, every time, and a reminder that the truth, however long it takes to come down from the mountain, always finds its altitude in the end. Take care, and God bless.